I'm Heidi Parker. I'm a sort of grantsmanship consultant here with MSU to go ahead and talk about some NSF stuff. So I'm going to start with some updates in case everyone doesn't get all the NSF updates. I'm just going to highlight the ones that are really important. The new deadline to submit is 5 p.m. your local time. So now everyone in California and the West Coast gets a little bit longer for their days and less rushing around. It's no longer, if anyone's ever done an NSF proposal before, you no longer have to write down every single collaboration you've ever had. This was kind of a big pain for people that are pretty well established in labs to, it was horrible also if you were collaborating with someone, because now you've just asked someone to fill out an Excel worksheet with 805 lines with everything they've ever worked on. What else? So this is a new thing that's for NIH as well, but instead of doing these individual bio sketches, you can use this third-party thing. There's a couple options, but Science CV is one of them. And so that'll be really easy. Another one is that on the individual solicitations, it used to have all of your formatting options, but they're pretty standard across the board, so the formatting is still the same, but it's just the standard thing on the NSF site, but you won't have it on the individual solicitation. More updates. So this is for your MSU person, the authorized organization representative. They certify all of your things electronically, and they're the ones who submit by 5 p.m. The support section is updated. Now this reflects all of your money, your internal money, your startup packages, everything that you're getting and putting towards the project. So that's a little bit different, and this is all on the NSF website, but these are the main new points. Also, no URLs are allowed in the project description. And the final new change is they have a new proposal checklist because they've made so many changes. Okay, so without further ado, here's my superstar panel. So Andy Anderson comes to us from Teacher Education. Weitska Van Osch is from Media Information. Mary Morash from Criminal Justice, Laura Dilley from Communicative Sciences and Disorders. But that all matters very little because what they want to talk to you about today are sort of general ideas about NSF funding. What's important is to get sort of a peer group when you get started. So if you're in biophysics or something really specific like criminal justice, to reach out to people to your right and to your left and also above you and find out what's been successful for them. But also, what will make you successful is having each part of your grant the best it can be. There's no section in the NSF grant that doesn't really matter or you shouldn't emphasize. All of them really matter because you don't know who you're up against, you don't know who your reviewers are. And so the seminar series that I'm trying to do is to show you how you can make the strongest application. Okay, so the first question we have, or briefly, what has been your experience thus far with NSF funding?
Starting with me. So I've had a series of grants over the years. The first one was in 1980, so that dates me a bit, I guess. I think as okay, trying again. Hearing me now? I've had a series of grants over the years. The first one was in 1980. As is typical for education funding, I think virtually every grant I've had has been funded by a different program from the grant before. There's very little continuity in programs in NSF EHR. So even though a lot of the grants have been part of the same general research project, one of the core issues has always been how do you keep track of how the programs are changing and what program is appropriate for the work that you're doing now. I'll stop there.
So, sorry, I was just teaching for 3 hours, so if my voice breaks up, I apologize ahead of time. When I first was invited for this panel, I actually thought, well, I can think of much better people in the college that have been definitely more successful with NSF than I have. But then I realized that maybe my story is a little bit unique and could really help people in the audience if they come from a similar situation. So I moved to the US only 4 years ago after doing my PhD at the University of Amsterdam in the business school. And in Europe, we don't really have much emphasis on grants. So there are grants, but they don't really target the business sciences or economics or any of these disciplines. So typically people in business school, they never even hear of grants. So when I first came to MSU and I heard that being successful at obtaining one grant as a PI, I was quite shocked and pretty nervous, and I didn't really know how to go about it because I had never ever written a grant proposal in my life. So I started from there, and I realized that probably the key thing was to collaborate with someone more senior who had experience with previous NSF funding, who had been successful, who had very successful grants with great outreach components, great publications emerging from it, and really learn from that person about the process, what needs to go into a proposal. I ended up doing 99% of the writing myself, so I don't want to say that I just abused this relationship, but I think it was critical in sort of obtaining the mentoring and guidance throughout the proposal of learning what do reviewers look for. He had also served on multiple panels, which would be probably another one of my recommendations. I'm actually going to go out for my first NSF panel ever in a month, so I'm really excited about that. And I've heard that that's the best way to learn what reviewers are looking for and what should go into a proposal. But for anyone in the audience who sort of came from a similar situation where you're moving to a new country, you don't have any existing collaborations in the university, you may have never had experience with grants in general, let alone with NSF, I think collaborating with someone who's been successful, who can mentor you, is key.
My collaboration team wasn't coming through with what I needed. And I basically just abandoned it because I thought it would be worse to send in yet another bad proposal that wasn't going to be funded. Then 6 years ago, I organized a new team of people, and we went through, I think, just 2 cycles, and we did get funded, and that was a 3-year study. And then we got a continuation grant, which is a little bit different format, not that different, but a slightly different format. And so it ended up being, it's now a 6-year study. And then I was able to work with a doctoral student who got a dissertation enhancement grant from NSF that was out of the same project, basically. So what I'm finding, I guess if I have a storyline in my story, is that you need to keep coming back. And also that what happens is you can build on things. Because now I was just talking this morning with a doctoral student and saying, you know, we might want to take an extra year and try to get you a postdoc to build on what we've already done while you're here as a doctoral student on this grant. And so you can kind of build a whole research program involving other faculty and other students once you get going with NSF.
Looks like this is on. Briefly, it's a turning point in my career to be up here and judged qualified to offer advice about NSF grants. My experience with NSF funding is that I have now been the PI of 2 successive NSF grants. The first was a career award that was awarded in 2009 and spanned the years of 2009 to 2014. The second NSF grant on which I've now been PI was awarded in 2014. So I, with my career award, had one of those stories that you just hear about because I put it in 2008 as a still quite junior faculty member, and it was initially rejected, as is to be expected, but it was scored well. And right around the end of 2008, I guess mid to late 2008, there was an injection of funding via the ERA stimulus package, such that I got a call from an NSF program officer one afternoon, much to my surprise, who said, "Hey, we just might be able to fund you. And lo and behold, she said, don't get your hopes up, don't get your hopes up. But the money came through, and they don't offer that kind of detail in their communications unless something good might be on the way. So just as I was really starting my career, the Career Award came through, and then it has led to another NSF project, which I'm happy to share more details about relative to my own experiences as we go forward.
That's a great story, and also a perfect example of how, at the end of the day, we always see success, either your grant was rejected or it's going to be funded. But there's a lot of muddled stuff in between. The world of academia is getting used to mostly being rejected, which sounds horrible, but your measure as a scientist and as an academic isn't as much how often you achieve success as it is how well you recover from rejection. And what you see on these panels are people that are successful, like, oh, he's getting funded, he's been funded for all these years, she's got this, she has that. But if you ask those people how often their papers are rejected, not just alone their grants, it happens a lot. It's what you do with those reviews and how you turn that one rejection into an acceptance the next time. So I think that's really important. Okay, the next section is about your writing process. And I'd also like to, what percentage of your grants do you write? What is your writing process, and how has that changed over time?
Also, one comment on don't get your hopes up. If an NSF program officer calls you and says, we have a few more questions, but you're not funded, don't get your hopes up, you can get your hopes up. That's usually a sign that you are on the list, and they're planning to fund you unless you mess up somehow. So writing process, I think it's interesting that the process of developing the ideas for a grant is very much collaborative. You need to be working with people, and you need to be talking about ideas and sharing data and things like that. The process of doing the work is very much collaborative. You need to have partners and graduate students and other people that you're working with. The process of writing, I think pretty much every successful grant I've been involved with has had a single lead writer. And that has almost inevitably been the PI. And so when I've been a co-PI, the PI has been the lead writer. When I'm the PI, then I'm the lead writer. Other people contribute paragraphs and do critiques, and there's some sort of specialized chunks, like the evaluator or somebody who's doing some specialized analyses or something like that might write a little chunk that I'm just going to drop in. But the responsibility for creating a coherent storyline and fitting it into 15 pages and all that it comes down to me in the end. And I think it's virtually impossible to do it any other way, that there has to be a single person who's the buck stops with, who's responsible for making everything come together.
I definitely agree with that, because I think there's nothing more disturbing than when you read something with different writing styles in it, and I think that stands out to reviewers very fast. Another thing, I usually like to start with the title, which sounds maybe really silly, but when I start writing, I like to come up first with a very catchy title that I feel kind of summarizes the whole project, and it gives me sort of a goal, or at least a theme to which I'm going to write. After that, I typically like to start with the broader impacts and intellectual merits, because they're two of the most important review criteria, especially nowadays for NSF. And again, I think it helps you tie everything together and create a very coherent story for the rest of your proposal. Other than that, with the writing process, one thing that I've realized, especially I just put in a proposal for a pretty new category of grant, which is partnerships for innovation, which are actually collaboration between an industry partner and a leading institution, which has to be a university. And I noticed that writing process for different grants are very, very different. So the grant that I currently have as a PI is a grant from the Cyber Human Systems Division. It's a small grant, it's $500,000. And that grant I probably shouldn't be saying that out loud, but I think I wrote it in 2 days while I was in the hospital, and I was just right out of my surgery. And it got funded successfully, which is maybe not a good thing to say, but I think the reason it was successful, despite being written in such a crunch time period and not the ideal time when you're just out of anesthesia, is the fact that that was really my area of expertise. So, and I feel that reviewers are very good at picking up on that. So when you write something that is really so close to your area of expertise, you write papers on this topic all the time, you give presentations and talks about this topic all the time, it sort of comes naturally. And you can write a very good proposal in a very short time frame. Take now the example of the proposal I just put in, which was a collaborative proposal with industry, where there were about 30 different supplementary documents that you don't have in any other NSF grant. This writing process took me 6 full months because it was going back and forth with the legal team of the company to make sure I don't say anything bad about the company, that there are no possible risks involved in the collaboration that could damage their reputation or their commercialization potential. So I think it is good to keep in mind that not every grant opportunity is created equally. There's not one approach fits all. Some grants you may be able to write pretty fast. Other grants may take a lot of time and much more collaboration, not just with your research team, but also with industry or any other partners that are involved.
Yeah, I really agree with the idea that there has to be one person who pulls it together. And so I won't sort of talk more about that, but I'll try to say a few different things. One is I always aim to have my proposal complete at the worst a month before it's due, at the best 6 weeks, 2 months before it's due. And when I'm getting to the end, if it's not going to meet those deadlines, I give up and wait till the next cycle because I don't want to send in a bad proposal. And I know I can't do it any other way and make it really good. I found I have one collaborator who's very unique. She likes to write together, like in the same room. So usually there are sections of the proposal where she's more expert than I am. And we actually sit and argue and go word by word, actually over the whole proposal, but with an emphasis on those particular sections. And that's been a unique experience, but it's worked now for 2 proposals, so that's good. Let's see. I do use a person that our department contracts with. After it's all done, I think, she goes over and her expertise is kind of what I'd call advanced copy editing. She makes everything look good. She makes everything in the right font, in the right margins. I mean, I try to do that too. But she's also just a very logical person and a good writer. So sometimes she'll say, this isn't clear. She'll rephrase things or suggest rephrasing, things like that. So I have found that extremely helpful at the end. And the other thing is I spend a huge amount of time reading the rules, reading the priorities, breaking them down into simple statements, and basically studying them and what's supposed to be in what section, et cetera, et cetera. And I try to follow the rules exactly.
When I put together my first NSF proposal, I was flying blind. I used good principles of composition. I did a few things that helped me out in retrospect. I got a couple of examples of winning proposals from colleagues. I just wrote people I knew and said, hey, I knew you got this award. Could you share your proposal with me? That was very helpful. I also read the criteria well, and I tried to compose my arguments around those criteria. I also had a habit of, already in my research, of trying to stay up with the trends in the literature. what are the high impact trends, and trying to work those trends into my proposal. For my second proposal, I really have to give a shout out to the Office of the Vice President of Research and Graduate Studies, because I had attended one of the prior grant writing seminars a few years ago, 2013, and the person who ran the seminar laid out tremendous detail with respect to formulas that can assist with writing a coherent, well-reasoned, well-put-together grant proposal package. So I felt like I had a formula for the second grant proposal. I had a lot more confidence in what I was doing, and so I really want to thank the Office of VP RGS, and we all have really no excuse for taking advantage of these opportunities to hone our grant skills.
Yeah, definitely. By being here today, it does give you a step up. And if you can take these things and build your confidence, because what you're trying to do is convey a proposal that shows your enthusiasm, but also clarity for what you're proposing. And you should be enthusiastic. You have a job where literally someone pays you to study what you're passionate about. Not very many people can say that. You know, imagine if you had to go to a job at a factory every day. Not so great, right? It's hard to have enthusiasm with that. I think that a lot of people are more comfortable sometimes telling a story about their research and about their project, and it's easier to tell a story with enthusiasm. But sometimes when you write, especially if you find it an arduous process, you lose that enthusiasm. So sometimes if you start to almost read what you've written out loud, and you know, if you can record yourself and turn that into your writing, I think that helps a lot. And also, I'll give another plug like Mary did for the copy editing. If you're not the strongest writer in the world, or you don't have the time for it, go ahead and get someone else who's part of your research group, even an undergrad, you know, in journalism or something like that. It can really make the difference. And it gives you more confidence too if you know that other person's really good at looking at margins and they have the font. And it gives you that moment at the end where you can kind of take a deep breath and feel like you've checked all those boxes on your checklist. Okay, so the next question, it's about advice on preliminary data.
So I find myself coming back around and always wanting to say something about responding to other family. So I'd have to say that I definitely do not have stuff done a month in advance. I'm a last minute person, and it you know, there are ways to make that work. And I find collaborative wordsmithing totally crazy making. So I depend heavily on track changes, on you know, exchanging drafts and going through lots of drafts and having people respond in track changes. And you know, I accept some and reject others, and they write things, and you know, so a lot of back and forth. But and so there's, on the one hand, there's kind of conversation going on about, so what are we trying to do and why? And on the other hand, there's this copy editing kind of thing that's going on through exchanges of multiple drafts using track changes. And so going on then to talking about preliminary data, when I think about writing a proposal, I think for me, there actually is one part that is the key part. And this is based on my experience reviewing as well as my experience writing. The hardest part, and the thing that separates proposals very often, is the research plan. You know, you have some preliminary stuff about you know, the general ideas and results of prior research and so forth. And there are lots of people who can do that pretty well. But then it comes down to, so what is it that you're actually going to do? If you're like me and the research that you're doing is got a qualitative component to it, that I can't just say, you know, we're going to collect these kind of data and then we're going to churn away with the statistical methods and we'll have the results at the end. So we have this sort of, and then a miracle happens. You know, we're going to collect the data and then we're going to analyze it, and we're going to discover something interesting in these data that we're collecting. And so we have to make a case for So what assurance do we have that you're actually capable of discovering this interesting stuff in the data? And partly that involves having a clear plan, and being able to define the data that you're collecting and having research questions that are clearly answerable on the basis of the data. And the other part very often involves something like preliminary data. You need to be able to say, well, I already know how to do this, and the way I can tell you that I already know how to do this is I'm going to tell you about the previous study that's leading into this study, and the interesting things that we're finding there. And you can see how what we want to do next is just building on that previous study, that it leaves us with this important question, and with these additional data we'll be able to answer this important question, and that's how we're making progress. So I think that preliminary data of some kind, prior data, is virtually essential for a good proposal. And if you're just getting started, that's kind of the core question, is what can you do in order to have something to say about your prior work that makes a panel believe that you're capable of doing what you say you want to do. And if you've got a previous grant, then that's a big leg up. Another thing that's been helpful to me is when I've been a participant in a center, that there's been like the Center for the Study of Curriculum Materials and Science. I was part of that center, and I got funding for a little bit of work that was based on the work of that center, and the work that I did through the center was leveraged to use the data and the results that I got from that in order to write a grant for additional work in the direction that I'm particularly interested in. And moving on from there. I think that MSU is pretty good about having seed grant programs that will give you $50,000 or $100,000 to develop an idea and to collect some data that you can then use as a basis for a grant that you're writing yourself. If you are writing something that's a continuation of your dissertation, then again, or work that you were doing with previous collaborators, again, that's an opportunity to include data that you already have and use that as a basis for your argument in the methods section about this is why you should have trust that if you give me the money to do what I say I'm going to do, good things will come out of it. So this question of how do you have some data to talk about, and of course if some of that's published, that's definitely another good thing. I think another thing to think about is a foundation for successful grant funding is successful publication, and it's usually early in your career. It's often easier to get your work published than it is to get grant funding, and so if you start out working on publications so that you're going to have that to talk about, that's a good move to make early in your career.
So I also would like to just very briefly go back to the previous question and then talk about preliminary data. Two more things. So it was already mentioned that looking at previous successful proposals is key, but I think equally valuable is looking at proposals from colleagues that were rejected and asking if they don't mind sharing with you the reasons for their rejection, so you can actually see, okay, what were sort of the critical flaws that I can avoid in my proposal. And then another thing is going back at in the system of NSF to see which other projects have been funded from this particular program, and is there a common theme in the broader impacts that this specific program really seems to value. So for instance, my funding typically comes from the Cyber Human Systems program, and their broader impact is really about how do we get women and minorities to enter STEM education and STEM careers. And typically you see that if a proposal doesn't speak to those themes, it will not receive any funding. So again, looking at these examples of other projects that have received funding and how they define, because you can always read the summary online, how they have defined their intellectual merit and broader impacts, I think is very crucial to writing a good proposal that is in line with the goals of the program. Then about preliminary data, I think that without preliminary data, it's very hard to get funding, especially in the type of research I do. So all my research involves data from industry. Like most of my current projects involve log data from an internal social media system from a company, an internal project management system from companies. So that means that all the employee data is there, all the intellectual property of the company is stored there, all the private conversations in secret groups where employees think no one has access to that data, and that data is being analyzed. It is analyzed through algorithms, so I'm not going through it myself, reading all the private details from people's conversations. But for NSF, it's always a big concern, is the company continue to go and provide you with this type of data, or was this a one-off data dump that you're going to get and you're never going to get data again? So having preliminary data analysis in your grant and showing that you've been able to receive this data at several times in the past, you've been able to analyze it, publish from it, gives NSF the confidence that if they're going to give you the money, it's not going to be wasted. And related to that, I think in these type of projects, it's also critical to get letters of support from the organization, not just in terms of saying, okay, we're willing to support this project, but promising to be willing to continue to provide you with the sensitive data in the future, because NSF really needs to know that if they're going to give you money for analyzing so-called sensitive data or private data or confidential data.
Yeah, I guess the way I approach, do we need prior findings or preliminary findings is, I think there's a bigger question, which is, do we need to demonstrate that we can actually do this research? And there are different ways to do that. One is to get these letters of cooperation that, yes, the Department of Corrections will give me access to their probation and parole officers so I can try to recruit both them into the study and their clients into the study. One thing, unlike my other major funding source in my field, National Institute of Justice, NSF does not want just, we think this is a great idea, or we support the project. They don't really want that kind of letter of support, and they discourage that, and they probably don't even look at them, or maybe they discard them or something. What they want is letters that spell out in some detail how this agency is going to give you access, do something to make this research happen. So I think that's important. I mean, this may seem really simplistic, but I have reviewed for my colleagues and friends NSF proposals, and they're doing quantitative analysis, and they don't do a test of power. I mean, that's just unconscionable. You just do it to show that your sample size is big enough to find something. I have used some preliminary findings when I got the extension on the existing research. In fact, the rules are slightly different when you want a continuation or to build on something you've done. And in those 15 pages, you have to write a whole separate section about what you've already done, which takes up the space to talk about what you're planning to do. So there you have ample room, more room than you want maybe, devoted to that task. But most of the proposals we've written, we haven't had data already. And a selling point has really been that nobody has collected this kind of data before. But we did a lot to try to demonstrate feasibility access. I tried to help a friend of mine write a proposal to the sociology section, and it was to collect data from NGOs and battered women in India. So she did a study. It wasn't really the beginnings. It just basically demonstrated she could get access to these people and get the kind of information she needed from them. And she did some preliminary interviews, but she certainly didn't do what I'd call like a pilot study or anything. So I think it's really all about demonstrating you can really do this research and it will pay off.
My preface to my comments about preliminary data is that, of course, preliminary data matters more the more senior you are. So for my first NSF proposal, I was in a situation where, because I was a new investigator, I didn't have the burden of having as much preliminary data in hand as I would have had today. That said, I was, in retrospect, did some things that helped out with respect to marketing the data. Let me read you a sentence from my proposal. Preliminary studies described in this proposal demonstrate tantalizing results regarding contributions, blah, 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 not previously reported in the literature. So I played it up. I played up what I had, I think aptly so, and that surely helped. But another thing I didn't realize back then was that as you go on and have this burden of having results in hand, that data constitutes feasibility data in the eyes of the reviewers, such that your entire proposal hinges around how you structure your research aims. So that if you pitch your research aims in a way that makes it look like they're dependent on having certain data in hand that you don't have, you're doomed to failure. So you have to be very strategic in how you put together your research aims, and maybe not even do certain research that you would like to do, or just have it, in your back pocket for when you actually get the money, And so, you have to be very thoughtful. One last comment that's helped me out with respect to proposal preparation: figure captions in preliminary data are a way of adding a lot of detail regarding methodology in a small font size, so you get a lot of bang for the buck in explaining your methods.
Yeah, I think it's really important. When a reviewer reads your grant, they shouldn't be questioning, is he or she going to be able to do this? It is about feasibility, and this feasibility, as our panelists have said, it comes in the fact of, if you are a young researcher and you don't have, the biggest reputation or the most papers or the most whatever, you have to show it in another way. You have to show it with preliminary data, or you have to show, if you don't have all that data, how I'm going to do this, what I have access to, so that question is really shut down. Also, if anybody has questions during this time, just raise your hand and Jeff will bring the microphone to you. Do you have any questions? No, not yet?
Heidi, can I add one more
Yeah.
thing on what we were talking about? The literature can help you demonstrate your feasibility. So for example, we propose to go and re-find now for 6 times women on probation and parole. This is one of the hardest groups to re-find and re-interview because they constantly move. They're easiest to re-find when they're in prison, unfortunately, because then you know where they are. But what helped, I think, is that we actually happened to have a great researcher on campus who did a study of how do you find women who are having lots of problems. She was looking at battered women, and she demonstrated what exactly you can do to keep track of them and to re-find them and re-engage them in follow-up interviews. And so finding literature like that you've gone the extra route to find scientific evidence of how to feasibly do your study and accomplish it, I think really helps.
Perfect. Did you have something to add?
No.
Okay, this time's okay. Okay, how do you handle collaborations, and what would be your advice for fostering new collaborations?
So I think collaborations are necessary for all grants, and especially when you start to get into larger grants. They're necessary not only because you can't, at least the work I'm doing, I normally can't do all the work myself. I have to have other people that I'm working with that I can make a convincing case they're capable of doing the things that I can't. and also because you just have better ideas if you're working with other people. And so the process of finding collaborators and talking with them and working with them is normally, for me, that's a process that takes months or years leading up to the time that the grant is actually submitted. And there's usually lots of back and forth about, so, well, could we maybe write a grant about this? And, this seems like a good idea, and let's have a phone call next week, or, write a long email that's got, this is a bunch of stuff I'm excited about, and what do you think? And, here's somebody else that's also interested in this. That whole process of building a community of people who share your interests and your vision for what you want to do it's a long-term process. It takes often years. I know as I've started to have one grant leading into another that some of the same collaborators keep going from one grant to the next, and so that helps that process go on. So it's essential, and it's essential to have those ideas and roles on the table. And then when you get started on the grant itself, there needs to be a shift toward a much more controlled kind of process. That when you're brainstorming, it's wonderful to have these discussions about, you can do this and I can do that. We're both really interested in this other thing. And then you got to have a budget. And that's the point at which you have to say, you have this many dollars, and that's all you get. And that, in my experience, that usually comes before the proposal is written, that it would make sense if you could somehow work out conceptually everything that you're doing and then assign it. It doesn't quite work that way. And so there's this process of imposing the discipline in 15 pages and imposing the discipline of the budget limit on the process. And that involves, if you're the PI, telling your collaborators, no, you've got $150,000 to do your part, and that's the budget number that you need to hit. And so it's, that process of going back and forth between the kind of openness to ideas that you need when you're developing the ideas and the closure that you need to develop a coherent, well-organized grant. There's a shift there that happens, and it often happens, in my experience, it often happens around budgets before all the conceptual pieces are completely nailed down. As we talked about writing before, I often ask for short pieces of writing. I do a lot of asking people to edit drafts. And sometimes when we're putting a grant together, I'll say, okay, we start with the process of I'll do this section and you'll do this section and somebody else will do this section. And that requires a next step, which is a very ruthless editing kind of step that I find it easy when I'm writing something to look at a previous draft and say, this section isn't really working, and I'm going to have to wipe it out and start over. When somebody else has worked hard on that section, it's hard to do the same thing, that you start worrying about egos and relationships and things like that. There's a limit to the degree of how much you can do that. To some extent, you have to say, I'm going to treat this just as if it were my own writing. And if there's a chunk here that doesn't work, I'm going to mark it right out, just as I would if it were a draft of my own writing. I think there's also there's a temptation to try to include more information in the scopes of work or in letters of support or things like that. NSF is not really, they don't want you to do that. That's part of the rule about not including URLs, that they're saying we're going to have a panel. That panel, mostly they're going to read the 15 pages of the project narrative, and they're going to look at the budget, and don't count on them to do anything else. So if your collaborators are playing an important role, you've got to find a way of describing that role in the 15 pages. And then it's good to have a letter of support that confirms that they understand that's actually what they're going to do. But the description of what they're going to do needs to be in the 15 pages. And so I think those are the main things that I have to say about working with collaborators, that there's this mix between open conversation and respecting the constraints that the budget and the 15-page limit apply to you, and being able to deal with collaborators on both of those bases at the same time.
I think with collaborations, it is too late to start identifying collaborators once you've identified the program. So I think even regardless of if you're planning to apply to a particular program for a grant, pretty much what I did from the day I joined here, I knew what was my research agenda for the future. I started affiliating with centers on campus, research groups on campus that did research in similar areas, but that spanned colleges. So I knew that I would be able to satisfy the requirements of interdisciplinarity once I started working on proposals. So I think being part of a research group that spans multiple colleges, for me that's usually business, communication, and engineering, that are the critical three, and making sure that you start building these relationships with people in these colleges is critical. I'm guessing the panel is going to talk mostly about these type of collaborations, so I want to move a little bit toward the industry collaboration, which is very critical for my work and maybe for some of you as well, which is that once you start collaborating with industry, there's always this trade-off between industry wants short-term results and NSF wants broader impacts and intellectual merit that the company may not always value. So how do you tie those together in a proposal? And I think doing that requires more effort than simply writing a proposal. It also requires negotiating with industry to see how can the research that I'm doing result in sort of short-term gains that the company may use to enhance productivity, enhance innovation, enhance collaboration, whatever it may be. So finding ways to manage the expectations of industry and being able to use some of your results in a way that can apply to them to make their day-to-day situation better is very critical. Another component of that, and I think we have some great resources on campus that I'm not sure everyone is aware of, is that it's when you decide to start working with industry for funding, it's critical to meet with the MSU Technologies Office and MSU Business Connect, not just to I don't know, find ways to maybe identify industry partners if you haven't been able to do so, but learn more about the legal process. What's involved if you start developing intellectual property and patents together? How do you create licensing agreements that are joined between industry and universities? And all of these types of legal aspects of the collaboration that as a researcher you don't think of at all because you may not have previous experience. So definitely take advantage of these resources on campus to learn more about what is involved in collaborating with industry partners, which I think is a great way to obtain funding because you already kind of satisfied a broader impacts requirement because now what you're doing is going to be used by industry in their day-to-day operations. So I think that's very important.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what I can add because I agree. I don't know anything about the industry collaboration, but the other things you've said, I think are very much very important. The one thing I found over time is your collaborators may change. I found that not after we got the money, but while going through revisions of the proposal, some people just lost interest or they really didn't want to do what we thought they wanted to do, and so we just generally shifted and added people or subtracted people. My last two NSF grants have had, there's me and 3 co-PIs, so that's quite a few people to be working on the same grant. And what I find is over time they kind of evolve and prefer to do certain things and others, and I end up picking up all the pieces nobody else wants to do. So that, you know, it just sort of develops over time what you actually do. And in writing the proposal, we got a lot of compliments each time that there were a lot of co-PIs, but we spelled out, but each one clearly had a unique contribution to make. So I think that's important in the proposal stage, just And I think it's what you were saying too, just really spelling out what is the special expertise and the special activity that this person is going to bring to the proposal.
In terms of collaborators, I think it's useful to distinguish who's on the project proposal from general productivity. So for my first NSF my career award, I was the sole investigator, but for the follow-up NSF award, there are 2 other collaborators who allow me to add electroencephalography to my plan, which I don't do myself. So in terms of productivity, you have to demonstrate productivity to get a grant. And my own general approach to doing science has been an attitude of inclusivity. Let's share the wealth. If we get a publication, we all win. So having more collaborators helps you divide the labor and get the job done of publishing papers. When you're thinking about formulating a project proposal for a competitive NSF grant, you want to think about how good people look on paper. And so who's going to look better on paper? Well, a senior researcher is going to look better on paper, but in point of fact, you know, the senior people usually are more tied up in ongoing projects. They have less bandwidth and resources to commit time to working with you. So there is a calculus you have to do about when and how to bring in, you know, more junior people. Given that I'm a junior person, you know, it doesn't make sense for me to bring in more junior people unless they're really accomplished. And, you know, sometimes junior people have more energy to make tenure and or maybe good ideas or not, so you have to be selective. But in thinking about the proposal plan, be sure to distinguish collaborators from consultants, because you can always bring in somebody as a consultant to add needed expertise and not elevate them to the status of collaborator.
Just one thing I forgot to mention. One thing I've noticed recently is that with large NSF grants, when they're very collaborative and they involve a lot of co-PIs, that it's critical to assign a half-time graduate assistant for project management. Because NSF really doesn't want to see that you have a huge team and that the PI is probably going to do all the project management, and now the PI's expertise in this research area is going to be lost to managing all the interactions, managing all the email, managing the knowledge repository. So that it's really critical to, in that case, when you have a complex team, to have a grad assistant or someone that you spell out in the proposal and the student mentoring plan that that person is going to be doing the project management activities, scheduling the meetings between the co-PI, doing newsletters or whatever it is that you may need to manage this large team, so they know it's not on the plate of the PI.
I guess one other quick thing I'll mention is that I know in my field, collaboration with schools becomes an essential thing. And the problems there are different from collaboration with other academics, and that oftentimes the key question there is, in the proposal, you're asserting that the schools are going to, that this many teachers and this many students are going to participate in these ways. And what you need there is evidence that that the schools are going to perceive this as a good deal. And that's partly by building into your research plan things that will make it a good deal for the schools, but also a matter of finding schools that are willing and ready to work with you and can provide a letter of support that says, yeah, we would like to do this.
Perfect. I did want to touch on the point again of sort of weeding out collaborators, because often when you present your ideas or you're talking with someone and brainstorming, people can be really enthusiastic and they want to bring this to the table. And it seems great, and everyone's well-meaning most of the time, right? But how can you weed out those people who aren't going to follow through? Because if you write, you know, their specialty into your specific aim, it's really hard then when, at the 11th hour when they don't come through to sort of write that out or replace them. So how do you guys recommend weeding them out?
Well, I mean, what's happened to me is it was trial and error. So when my first statistician showed up and said she thought power tests were silly, I said, well, we need to write this in here. And then it became apparent she wasn't really interested. It was just, it would have been nice to be on a grant. And so it kind of took care of itself. Other times it's actually been more rocky. Like, actually, I wasn't a PI, but another person was trying to write the grant that I actually said, let's abandon. And we did abandon because people weren't giving the PI or me, who was trying to help the PI, the right things. So some of it isn't really rational. It just happens over time. You kind of evolve. You see what people really, and they develop an interest in the project, or they don't stick it out and don't come through with what you need.
I think for me, the budget becomes a big weeder-outer. That, you end up confronted with the fact that, here's something that needs to be done, and it's one of several things that need to be done. And you may have somebody who knows how to do this, but it would be very expensive for them to do this, and you can't afford it, and somebody else who can do it in a way that you can afford. Or something that, when you get down to it, your budget is just not going to cover everything you hoped it was going to cover, and therefore somebody doesn't fit. There's some people you're saying, the whole reason I'm doing this is I want to work with this person. And that person, you find a way to make room in the budget for them. Other people, you don't. And so that probably is a key weeder-outer for me.
I also want to say here that as much as it can be disappointing if someone doesn't pull their weight, sometimes just having had their name on the proposal is what got you your funding. So you should be thankful for that, and you can't always just judge them based on the effort they do. And I recently had that experience where someone was an award-winning researcher in that area, and that was the theme of the proposal. I'm not sure I would have received the funding without his name on the proposal. I knew he was very busy. I knew that he was probably not going to do as much as I would like him to do. So as was recommended earlier, I added him more in a consultant role, so for a low percentage for all years, to have more his senior guidance and mentorship throughout the process. Even there, I was a little disappointed, but again, I had to be thankful for the fact that his name is probably what did get me the funding. So I think you also need to look at that from that perspective and not just always judge someone only on the effort they put into it.
I would say just briefly that you should roll with the punches. People are going to be busy sometimes and can't help out with your project. Just adapt your goals. You can always find ways to be productive by maybe taking another project and dusting it off and making it fit the aims of the current proposal, so that you have that ongoing productivity. And if you have an impasse, just try and find somebody else if there's no other solution.
These are great answers. I would also say the only time I've ever encouraged someone to drop a collaborator is if that collaborator was one of these people who goes MIA for a while. Like, oh, he's off the grid, he won't get back to me for a couple weeks. Sometimes this happens. That person better be amazing. That person better have a lot of publications and a lot of sway with this, because if they're living in a yurt in your backyard for a while but won't talk to you, that's not helpful for your proposal at all. Okay, so I want to know, broader impacts is a big section, and this is something that can really set you apart. And it also really, you can, use your creativity, enthusiasm, and think about, when you were a child and what got you to this point and got interested in this. So I wanted to know what each of the panelists do for broader impacts.
This is actually the section I have the least to say about. I think because of the nature of my research, that I tend to do design-based research that's focused on curriculum development in schools, or doing research on children's learning, doing research on professional development for teachers, and those are in and of themselves a kind of broader impact. And so it's inherent in the proposals that I write that I have to make an argument for how the work that I'm doing is it's scalable and it can continue in some form after the funding is gone. So for me, broader impacts is it's just sort of the key thing around which the research is being organized, that it's applied research. And if the broader impact is not central to the proposal itself, it's not going to be funded.
So there's a couple things I like to do for broader impacts when it comes to writing a proposal, and also once you have received the funding to actually come through and do that. So one of the first things is when I write the broader impacts from the proposal, because a lot of my work is with industry, I like to actually look at US government articles or whatever it is, speeches from Obama, and see where were references made to what the key goals are for the US economy. And can I show that my research ties in with those key goals? So that by doing this research, indirectly, I serve the president, so to say. So that's one thing I like to do. I do a lot of industry training and industry speaking engagements. And I feel that that, again, also serves me for future proposals, that people see, oh, she did come through on the broader impacts under her previous proposal. So giving keynotes at big industry events, I think, is very critical. And then, as I mentioned, for the programs that I typically submit to, STEM education, STEM careers for women and minorities are the key broader impacts. So I try to find ways to, for the graduate assistants that I hire, to make sure that I try to target these populations. I offer every year an honors research seminar through the Honors College, which is something you don't get teaching credit for, so it doesn't come out of your teaching load. You have to do it on top of your regular teaching. But it's a great way to involve undergraduate students that are very passionate about research, that usually come from very diverse backgrounds, and get them excited for STEM education, STEM careers from a very early age. And I feel that that resonates very well with NSF. I also been able to get some additional funding for existing grants by doing these type of seminars and getting funding to support teaching assistants for these seminars.
Yeah, I actually brought some examples, so if anyone's interested, I have examples you can pick up afterwards. But sort of echoing what was just said, I usually talk about impacts on practice, scientific training impacts, and I try to connect to the NSF interest in diversifying the workforce, but also making the workforce very excellent, and social impacts. Just how will this help society, the quality of life, things like that. And this is very important. Both the project summary and the project description require you to write about these broader impacts. And I think they take this especially seriously because this is how they use this to justify getting more NSF funding from the federal government. Let's see, I think the other one I have is, the other thing, I mean, you just think of what you're doing. So one of our broader impacts is we've now developed a cohort of 400 women who would like to be interviewed into the future. And they were very important and unusual group in that they've been in serious trouble with the law. And so now that's available to our graduate students, to undergraduate students doing special projects, things like that, things you might not normally think of. And we also developed a broader impact is we now have a group of 4 co-PIs from totally different disciplines, totally different methodological approaches who can now go on, we developed ourselves, and we can now go on and do other things. So anyway, you can talk about how you can kind of capitalize, and also, like you said, the education at MSU. MSU, luckily, has lots of opportunities to work, you can work with students across disciplines, get them involved in interdisciplinary work. You can work with undergraduates, get them into the field. So there are all kinds of broader impacts. And I almost don't like the word broader, because actually they're looking for things you could really do, which may be rather local broad impacts in some ways. Like you could help this one industry group, or you could help the students at MSU, and this would be a model in the future for others, and maybe you'll write an article about how you did that sort of thing.
So my first piece of advice is to write your broader impact section as broadly as you can convincingly make it. So my research has to do with the acoustic information in speech and how listeners extract words. When I got that call from the NSF program officer, after she delivered this news that I was told not to get excited about, she said, "And your abstract simply won't do. You need to rewrite your abstract to make it broader." So that forced me to go back and rethink what I had to say. And by the time I reworked that thing, I had the terms autism, stuttering, motor speech disorders, automatic speech recognition, and terms that I could make a convincing case my research related to somewhere down the road as a statement of broader impact. My second piece of advice relates to finding examples. In writing my career proposal, another good thing that I did was seek out published abstracts through the NSF website where people in my field had given their broader impacts, and I was able to take suggestions that they had offered up publicly through their own winning awards, and I was able to break down the broader impacts, education, and outreach dissemination components of my own award as follows. So for my education component, I proposed to bring in undergraduate as well as high school students to my lab and offer them research opportunities. I proposed to develop and enhance a course I was teaching to incorporate aspects of the science as well as the methodologies behind the science into their training. I proposed to create a seminar for doctoral students that focused on the specific areas in the award more broadly. And then for the outreach dissemination components, I proposed to make available training materials for a new coding system I developed, to offer a tutorial on that system at a conference, and to organize a workshop at a conference based around the topics.
So one other thought I'll add. I think that broader impacts in some ways is like preliminary data in that if you can demonstrate that you're already doing it, it helps a lot. So publications in practitioner journals, invitations to speak, or presentations that you've made at practitioner conferences, evidence about the number of visits to your website, any of those things that can show you've been serious about broader impact all along, and you've done some things that have already attracted the attention of the target audiences for your broader impacts. That's way more convincing than we're going to do this and this and this.
I would also add to ask people within your research groups, ask people in the classes that you teach if they have ideas. Ask civilians, or what I call people outside of academia, right? When you speak to other people about the kind of research that you're doing, a lot of them come up with things like, oh, that sounds awesome. I know someone who teaches junior high. She would love to have, a presentation in there or something incorporated. Start to think about that interface between the work that you do and the public. Okay, does anyone have any questions yet? I feel like you guys are all in a after lunch kind of lull. Yeah. Anything? No? All right. The last one is, how do you guys deal with deadlines? I know, Andy, you've already admitted that you're a huge procrastinator.
Yes. Well, and I guess you know, as my career has gone on, projects have gotten bigger. They become more collaborative, and that makes the deadlines trickier. I've already, I mean, I may sound like I'm obsessed with budgets, but I really find that very often that's where the crises occur. Again, it's partly because you have to start dealing with budgets early on in the process before you've actually pinned down, unless you are able to write your proposal a month in advance, which I'm not, partly because the people I'm collaborating with are you know, they're busy and they're not ready to get serious that far in advance. And so there's, and when it comes, the crises about deadlines often occur around budgets and scopes of work. And, you know, you have things like it's 2 days until the proposal is done, and somebody who's been delaying sends you a budget and says, oh, turns out that our grad students were a little more expensive than I was thinking, so I hope you don't mind that this is 10% over. And, you know, of course, I'm going, 10% over? What are we going to cut at this point? You know, when we're already sending all this stuff through CGA. And so that's the kind of thing that you have to work to avoid. Some of that involves being, you know, really having to nag people and push people to get their parts in, and particularly the parts that have impact on budgets, because that's the part that has to go through multiple steps of approval within the university and beyond. You know, if you end up with a budget that's over the limit, then you're not even going to be considered. So, you know, making that work is, in my experience, very often where deadlines become important. The other thing that I'd note is that I know in the College of Education we are really fortunate to have the IRTL, the Institute for Research on Teaching and Learning. I'm looking out at Marcy Wallace, who's sitting in the audience here, and hoping that I get the... and it's wonderful to have them, because for me, when I get ready to write a proposal, that I get a message. If you're going to apply for NSF DRK-12 grants, they are due in 2 months, and within the next week we need to hear whether you're intending to do something or not. And if you say, yes, I'm intending to do something, then you have somebody to work with you, and that person gives you a list of all the things that you're going to need, including ones that slip your mind or you otherwise wouldn't. You know, you need to have a postdoc mentoring plan. You need to have a statement about facilities. You need to have a separate statement about data management. You need to remember that to get your current and pending statements all in, and everybody needs to get biosketches all in. And what are you going to do? You know, and here's the things that you need for every single subcontract, and when and how are those going to come in? And so having somebody, for me, the fact that there's somebody to help with that makes it possible to produce more proposals than I otherwise could do, because a lot of that is very time consuming, and if you're doing it yourself, it detracts from all the other stuff that you need to do. And I'm so grateful to have somebody who gives me that list and holds my feet to the fire in terms of you haven't got this ready yet. When is it coming? And I know that there's this other part of the proposal that's critical to be written, but if you don't do this now, then that's going to have an impact on your ability to meet the deadlines when the proposal comes due. So I'm dependent on help from other people, and I'm kind of trying to be aware of where the most likely problems are going to arise in terms of meeting deadlines. And it's usually not about the writing itself, it's about some of this peripheral stuff.
So the first thing I'm going to say is to become really comfortable with becoming a stalker. Because that's been my experience, that sometimes you have to hunt down people to the point that they may get annoyed because you call them on their cell phone every 5 minutes but they have something that's critical, like their bio sketch, and without their bio sketch, you can't submit, and you just have to hunt them down. So be comfortable with that behavior, even if you make other people uncomfortable. The other thing is, we also have someone in the college that can support with some of the supplementary documents that you need to do, and they're never going to volunteer to do them. So ask for help, like current and pending support. They can do all sorts, they usually can make the budget files, the budget justification. Of course, you're going to have to go through it again to edit it and make sure it's complete, but they can do some of that work for the supplementary documents. But you always have to ask, so make sure that you go out there and ask them to help. The other thing is, I like to, especially the last grant that I already mentioned that I submitted was one where there were about 30 supplementary documents, including a patent search, a competitor analysis, market analysis, I don't know, you name it, and it was there. So create an Excel file where you keep track of everything and you set yourself deadlines for each of these supplementary documents, because oftentimes when it is a collaborative proposal, you get so lost in the 15 pages of the proposal that in the last week you realize that you have 30 of these supplementary documents that you can never pull together in a week. So make sure that you do familiarize yourself with all the supplementary documents that are required, and make sure you don't forget about them, and also set deadlines for them. And ideally, I'm also a bit of a procrastinator, but ideally you would want to finish 2 months or a month ahead of time, so you can ask, if it's a small proposal, I think if you have a lot of people already on the grant, they can do reviews of the proposal. But if it's just you and one other person, it is critical to get more eyeballs to look at the proposal and make sure that they point out any mistakes or inconsistencies that may be there. And then you need to allow yourself more time for this external review to take place.
Yeah, these folks around campus, and I think OSP has some of these people who will help you too, if your department doesn't, are essential. Like the person I described who did copy editing, she also makes an Excel file of everything that's due and what it has to do. And we have boilerplate in our department, for example, for handling of data and turning it over to archives and things like that. And she actually goes to meetings to get up on any changes or any requirements and special things we have to put in there. So that's a huge help. We have our own budget person who will do the budget. You just tell them what you need, and she'll do one budget, and then it's always too high. So she'll just keep working with you and cutting the budget. So I think those things are really important. One unusual thing, I don't know, maybe due dates are different for different divisions, but unfortunately we usually hear in December whether we've gotten what we applied for in August, and often a project officer will call and say, I can give you 2 or 3 extra weeks to get it in on the next cycle. And so unfortunately for us in the Law and Social Science Division, that's always over the holidays. But I do think and this kind of gets into the next section, but I do think if you can possibly make yourself respond, it's very important, because we'll at least probably have the same project officer there when it comes back, and the same, maybe a lot of people on the panel will be the same. And if you wait and don't do that, so that creates quite a crunch. And it could be other times of year that are not easy for you to turn it around again that fast, but it's very important to do that, I think. Other than that, I don't have anything to say about deadlines.
Regarding deadlines, of course, we all know to plan way out, but be also aware of the internal deadlines, because they're not the same deadlines as the deadlines that are being posted at NSF. Lean on people. At home, free up your time as much as possible. Don't be afraid to get babysitting, housekeeping, etc. At work, of course, we've already heard about support personnel that are instrumental with pulling together all those documents. And if you're not getting the support, if the support personnel aren't sufficient, then tactfully make your concerns known and ask for more resources and help. Another bit of advice is to structure your project goals and deadlines around conference deadlines and other key deadlines that will push your research forward. If it's that putting in some data at a conference will help you solidify a preliminary data set to substantiate a research aim, do it. And that helps with productivity on the grant itself. Finally, my last piece of advice is get your lab involved. Students are terrific at doing menial tasks related to proofreading sometimes, or data entry for references. I use EndNote in my lab. Have them download papers for you. Those things that we can all free up our own time for the intellectual parts and bugging people to get us those things. Let some students help with that too.
Okay, and so the final point, we're getting close on time, but the final point is processing reviews, and how do you take those rejections, sort of give yourself 2 weeks to get over it, like, don't be
Yeah, I was
so
gonna say,
angry.
So the first thing I do is I get mad. Sometimes I never get over that. There are some reviews that I've gotten that to this day, I think they were completely unfair and ill-informed, and and I never did get over it. Other times, it leads to the next decision for me is always, so is this the program to apply to? There are times that the review would say, well, I read the program announcement, and I thought on the basis of the program announcement they were interested in the kind of research that I want to do, but it's pretty clear they're not, and I don't want to do the kind of research that they're interested in, so I'm just not going to apply to that program again. The other quick thing I'd say is that I try to distinguish between comments that are identifying true weaknesses in the proposal, and sometimes that, there are times that when I get over getting mad, I find myself nodding my head and say, yep, they nailed it. That's exactly what's wrong with this proposal, and there's something I can do about it. And weaknesses that have to do with your failure to communicate what you were about. And I can also say, okay, I can clarify that. The last thing I'd say is, in my field, usually the opportunities to write in a particular program come up once a year. So there's a pretty good gap. You're going to have a different panel the next time around. So fixing everything that's wrong with this year's proposal in a way that responds to all the weaknesses that the one panel discovered is not a guarantee that the next panel will have the same criteria when they review, even if it's the same program.
Yeah, so I don't have a whole lot to add here. The only thing that I've realized is, so the grant I'm currently on was indeed rejected in the first round. It had 3 excellents and 1 fair, and the person who rated it fair said you should have cited this paper, which was very useless. But I actually found that the reviewers that had rated it as excellent gave really good comments that I was able to incorporate the next time around that I submitted it. So sometimes I guess people always have the tendency to look at the critical reviewers and see what was wrong with it, why did they reject it, but sometimes actually the comments from the people that liked it are more useful in revising your grant. And of course the panel is going to change, but the next time around I was successful in getting funding. So I think addressing the comments, also because I think a big difference between NSF and NIH is that there's still a lot of discretion at the level of the program officer, right? So the final decision lies with the program officer. At least I know that, especially with our program, he or she has a very strong say in the process, and he or she looks for the fact that you took into consideration the comments and that you took the time and the effort to address them. So yeah, that would be everything I have to add.
Yeah, do you all get panel summaries in addition to the reviews for your section? Okay, so it's common. Usually you get a panel summary, and project officers have always told me that's the most important. So if there's like a reviewer comment that everyone else says is a bad idea during the panel discussion, that criticism won't end up usually in the panel summary. And so the panel summaries are very important. And I have also found it very useful to try to have a talk with the project officer who was actually at the panel probably, and say, you know, I just want to make sure I'm understanding what are these the most important things to address and to change. And I found those helpful because sometimes I don't quite get it when I read the panel summary and the reviews about really what needs to be changed and what needs to be done. And also I found some project officers are more encouraging than the panel summary would suggest they should be. I've also seen cases with others and with myself where it's an outright rejection, you know, this is not worth funding, and then it gets revised and it gets funded. So project officers are changing, the panel is changing, and just times change, and if you're making changes in your proposal, you can't get too discouraged. I don't think it's unusual to go back 2 or 3 times. I think it's very common until you get your project funded somewhere. And I always apply for more. I always write my proposals differently, but I also apply to National Institute of Justice at the same time, so I have multiple versions of my proposals out there.
Briefly, my advice is after you get through that surprise reaction phase, get the advice of colleagues, have them read the feedback and get some perspective on whether those criticisms are valid ones that require major changes, or you can stand your ground to respond in a more eloquent, well-reasoned way in a revision that, in fact, you were right.
Okay, great. Please join me in thanking our panelists for all their really great advice this afternoon. I'm going to bring up the Office of the Vice President for Research to tell you a little bit about some other things that they offer. So I have a seminar series, 4 seminars, where I'm going to try to make your NSF grant as awesome as possible, to make basically walk you through every step that you need, incorporate a lot of this advice, work a lot on the writing and making your message really clear with the clear hypothesis. You guys want to go ahead? Do I have to put up slides for you? Oh, that's okay. Okay.
Hi, my name is Lauren Ernie Flessner, and I work for the Office of Research Facilitation and Dissemination, which is a division of VPRGS. And I wanted to take a minute to tell you a little bit about the grant proposal services that are offered through our office. We do market research, and we disseminate funding opportunities across campus to different colleges and departments. And we also meet individually with faculty members to help them to identify funding opportunities that would be appropriate for their research. We offer grant writing support, including a lot of what was discussed in this panel. We will help with budgets. We will help with supplementary materials that are included in your application package. We will also work on editing and formatting your proposal and provide some guidance on proposal development. We have monthly seminars throughout the academic year. Our upcoming coffee breaks are found on the flyer that's located on the desk as you walked in, so please check these out. The next one is next week. And finally, our office also provides funding for those of you who wish to travel to a funding agency to meet with program officers directly. This funding is usually matched by funding through your department or college, but there is funds available to do that.
I'm Jeff Croft. In VPRGS, my function is to coordinate editing and also peer review. We work with the colleges to defray the cost of going to external editors or getting peer review from external institutions. We do a 60-40 split with the college to go and defray the cost for that, encouraging folks to just kind of enhance what their proposals are. We also coordinating the seminars that Heidi and Tom, or is Tom? No, there's Tom. Tom Holland are doing both an NIH and an NSF track. So, in case you wanted to go into a deeper dive in regards to your proposal development for this year. And then finally, we want to encourage you, if you've got questions or some thoughts, we're going to have a grant funding mixer at 4 o'clock in the Red Cedar A and B to join us to go and talk with Heidi or Tom some more and discuss your proposals for this year. Thanks for coming.